Conrad was born in Francophone Switzerland in 1735. In order to avoid conscription into the French army, he fled with his wife Nancy first to the Netherlands, and then entered the service of a wealthy family in order to secure their passage to the United States. They landed in Philadelphia, and it was there that Conrad's wife bore a son, Conrad Jr. The family would later, after serving their time with the family and paying back the passage with that time, travel to the western wilderness of Pennsylvania. It was there that the younger Conrad would become one of the most affluent trappers and farmers in the western region of Pennsylvania. During the time of his death, he was in possession of more than 3,000 acres of northwestern Butler County. Conrad spent some of his time a few years ago garnering the attention of local lore enthusiasts. He also made me vomit on the side of the road, despite having been dead for 137 years.
Dear listeners, Dr. Pennsylvania.
I'm going to start this story this evening with just a couple quick disclaimers. The first of which being, I'm not using the family's last name. The family cemetery has become really popular over the years by people who are out there trying to seek out the supernatural and have that ghost experience. And while most people are pretty respectful of the land, couple years back, the cemetery was vandalized pretty heavily, and it upset a lot of people. I remember seeing some video on YouTube a couple years back where some guy was ranting about how you respect the dead and whatnot, and to be completely honest with you, I was really upset with the vandalism, not because of any sort of respect for the dead, because if I were to be totally honest, I think that sort of vanity dies with the person. Wasn't so much out of respect for the dead as it was just, it seems like such a useless activity to vandalize a cemetery, especially one that I don't believe has much visit from any family members and is more recognized as a historical and kind of legend-tripping landmark. Regardless, I'm going to refrain from using the family name because I wouldn't want to encourage anybody to vandalize it anymore. Beyond that, this story, in my second disclaimer, really 2.5, the second disclaimer is that this story that I'm going to tell, this is the creepiest series of things that's happened in my life. And though I want to be very clear that I don't really believe in ghosts, to give the old Edgar Allan Poe line, I've lived in fear of them just the same all my life. I really don't believe in ghosts, but I love a ghost story. And I love collecting ghost stories, and ghost stories are a comfort food. They're a trope that you can anticipate, and when there's that resolution, it pulls you in. And just the same, late at night, I have to run through the house and to get into the light because my imagination does go wild. So there's my full disclosure. In the winter of 2002-2003, I visited with my friend Corey. Corey, knowing about my proclivities to ghost stories, said that he had just seen some program on the television where they had visited a certain cemetery in our neck of the woods up in northern Butler County, northwestern Butler County, and they claimed that of all the places that they had ever visited, this cemetery was the most haunted. Over the course of the next few weeks, we talked to people. I spoke to some friends that had attended the high school which serves that area where the cemetery is located and asked them stories, and it seemed like everybody had either heard of the place but never visited it, or had visited the place and had what they considered a real story. Most of the stories involved batteries dying and phones or cell phones kind of being a newer thing that was starting to become ubiquitous around that time. Batteries dying in cameras, cars dying, car batteries dying. And there was one story that we always took very seriously, funny enough, in which the group of people going to the cemetery in the middle of the night were locked out of their car and had to hike a few miles to the nearest home. This cemetery is located on a lake, and the nearest house is kind of a good trek down an old dirt road, and it has all those kind of rural gothic images that kind of make you uneasy, especially if you're walking down that road in the middle of the night. Despite all the testimonials from friends and other people, friends of friends that we could find, we had a difficult time actually locating the cemetery itself until one evening. My friend Jared and I went, and he had gotten a tip, and we drove up to the lake, and we turned onto a side road past an old farm on the outskirts of the township, and there was an old dirt road, and there was a sign posted that said no winter maintenance, and we drove down that road what felt like a mile and a half. We come to a little pull off, and pull off and park, and we put our windows down because of the story that we had heard of the people getting locked out of their car and having to hike back to the farm and being terrified from the ordeal. So we first rolled the windows down and stepped out, and across the street there were one and a half, one had broken, but there was a black stone obelisk that marked the cemetery, and the graves themselves were in a hand-cut wall. We sat there for a little while. We didn't actually walk inside the walled area. It's pretty small and choked up with gravestones, a few of them newer, some of them having fallen over. There were a couple very impressive looking older ones, and with it being an older cemetery, there's of course the graves of a lot of very young children, and that's, the harsh reality of time. And so we sat there and we talked about finally finding the place and how quiet it was and how removed from the rest of the area it was. And we kind of wondered that before the lake was expanded, before the lake in the 60s, what would the rest of this area like? And we'd already heard some stories that there had been a big farm there, and we'd seen evidence of trees that weren't but 100 years old. We kind of got the lay of the land a little bit. There's a hill that sits behind the cemetery, and our impression from some of the stories that we had heard was that the farm, and I'm still not sure if any of the buildings from the farm exist. I find it doubtful that they do, but that the farm sat up on top of that hill and back a ways. While my friend and I were standing around there, we started hearing dogs barking in the distance, and that didn't set us off at all, but we were getting it was a little unsettling being there at dusk. So we noted the dogs barking for whatever reason, because there seemed to be a good bit of them, but we got into the car and we drove off, getting back onto the main road right as the sun was going down low on one of the western hills. Later in the week, I ran into my friend Corey, who was the one who had seen the television show which first piqued our interest in this cemetery. He told me that a lot of the stories that he had heard involved the dogs that we had heard barking, because I mentioned that it had been very quiet, and all of a sudden some dogs started going nuts, and we didn't know what was going on. We figured somebody was coming with a bunch of dogs, or maybe someone was driving deer. And he said, well, no, some of the stories I hear, they say like red eyes will chase you out of the area, and that the dogs that you hear are actually the dogs of Conrad Jr., the trapper who made a good bit of coin back in the day trapping and farming. It was a little weird, but I dismissed it. So now that I had been there, now Corey wanted to go there too, and as did a couple of other friends, and we were trying to find the place again. I was retracing the steps that I had taken with my other friend, and we're there in the wee hours of the morning, and I am so worked up to be there at like 2-3 in the morning that when we get to the dirt road, I was shocked that I had been able to find it again in the middle of the night, especially since I hadn't driven the first time I was there. But I was so worked up, I actually had to step out of the car and throw up a couple of times, which really, if you knew me and some of the stomach issues I have, this is really not incredibly remarkable. But I was younger then, and it was kind of it was embarrassing. It still is, but we went back to the cemetery and rolled down the windows, left the headlights on, and we stayed there for a little while and just kind of talked about it. There's 3 of us there. There's my friends Corey, Brandon, and myself. Brandon, for the trip, had purchased one of these disposable cameras you used to be able to buy at the pharmacy. You may still be able to. I don't know. At this time, at least nobody that I knew of really had access to digital cameras. We were aware that they existed, but they weren't as common as they are now. Sorry to sound old, regardless. Brandon had a camera there, and he was taking a couple shots as the 3 of us stood around the cemetery and talked about it and kind of relayed some of the things we had heard. Corey's family's Ford Explorer was sitting there with the headlights on still and with the windows down because of our concern that whatever was lurking about in the woods would lock us out. After about 20 minutes, we started to get bored and nothing really weird was happening, thankfully. So we went back to the Explorer and we climbed in and Corey started it up. It was a late spring evening and it was pretty warm, and the Explorer had a temperature gauge in the car up by the ceiling up front, and it was such a novelty to me that I was always staring at it. And when we had arrived there 20 minutes earlier, about, the temperature gauge read 70 degrees. Now, once we started the car back up, the temperature gauge read 43 degrees, and if you're keeping score at home, that's roughly a 27 degree drop in temperature. And these cold phenomena are one of the things that ghost people are always citing as being evidence of a draft. I don't know, but we're outside and Corey notices it, Brandon notices it. We're all a little creeped out because Corey swears that this temperature gauge is fairly accurate, but the big thing is it never, once you start the car up, it doesn't take a minute to warm up to get to the right temperature. So we drive down the dirt road and the temperature's remaining in the 40s, and we turn onto the side road and it starts climbing then, and the temperature doesn't climb back up to its actual, it doesn't get back up into the 70s until we're back on the main road and driving. And so I was there for that night. We were all kind of shaken up by the temperature thing. I was still trying to dismiss it because even though I don't believe, it's very easy to shake me up on these things. And Brandon got that film developed and he swears he sees mists and whatnot, but really what I see is his cigarette smoke, and we would always argue about that. However, there would be an event a couple weeks later that I was not around for, but Brandon and Corey were. And this was the weird night, the really weird night. I had been out running. It was a sticky night, an extra warm night, and I had to be at work very early in the morning, so it wasn't too late when I got back home, having given up on running because just the still sticky night, it wasn't good. Grabbed a shower, went downstairs and sat and watched the Weather Channel or documentary, preparing to fall asleep on the couch. I got woken up around 1 in the morning by Corey and Brandon, who I had been with a couple weeks earlier on their visit to the cemetery. And with them was another friend, who we'll call Art because that was and is his name. They're excited, not in a good way. They're shaken up. They're really shaken up. And Brandon starts telling me about what happened, and Corey is interjecting, and Art's not saying a whole lot. Brandon tells me that they went out to the cemetery again, and he asked me if I knew how still the air was that night. I said, yeah, I was out running, and it's just a muggy, stagnant air day, and it just wasn't much good, so I didn't run my normal go. And he said, well, we went up to the cemetery, and they did their normal thing. They pulled off and kept the headlights on, rolled the windows down, and went over to the cemetery. And Art wanted to go in, but the way the headlights cut across the wall, you couldn't see below the wall. It was just an abyss. So he steps into the gate, and Corey and Brandon follow him. They hear a thud. And what the hell is that? So Brandon lights his lighter, and they peer down, and Art has knocked over one of the tombstones. And when they realize this, all three of them swear to me. They swear to me that the wind picks up. And not just a little bit, but a good gust. And it starts blowing the leaves from the previous autumn around and into their face. And they swear too that they started hearing something come walking down, crashing of branches, shuffling of leaves, coming down the hill from behind the cemetery, from where we speculate that the old farm had been. And as they're telling me this, they're really shaken up. And I am too, because this is kind of creeping me out and exciting me at the same time. Brandon says they vaulted the wall to get back to the Explorer as quickly as they could. They jump in, lock the doors, roll them windows up, and they tear down that dirt road, and they drive directly to my house. That drive is the better part of half an hour, maybe a little more. It's been a long time since I've driven from the cemetery back to that old house, but they were still shaken up at that time, and that hit me maybe more than the temperature thing did, because these three, particularly Brandon and especially Corey, were going to be reticent to yield any sort of weakness before a person, especially a friend, as we all grew up ragging on each other as kids would do. And so for them to open up some sort of vulnerability and some sort of fear like that, really didn't know how to take that other than to believe them, and at the very least in that patronizing way, and where you believe the thing that they experienced was not a figment of their imagination, but was them trying to justify it some supernatural way. It doesn't matter. It really shook me up. And I've only been there a few times in the years since. So this is 2015 right now. So we're talking about 12, 13 years ago. Anyhow. So that's the story. That's the story of Conrad. Now, the family would go on to not only be landowners of quite a good swath of northwestern Butler County, but as I understand it, the family would also be instrumental in the foundation of the Butler County Bar Association, as well as the Armstrong County Bar Association. Some of the family names that married into this family are known still. There's still some attorneys that bear this name, and some of the family names that married into this family whose cemetery is in northwestern Butler County. A lot of roads, as well as they settled at the time that Conrad Sr. arrived. In western Pennsylvania, the American Revolution was still being fought, and we here in Pennsylvania were actually declaring war on the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time, the governor of which was Thomas Jefferson, because of a border dispute between us and the Commonwealth of Virginia's sea-to-sea charter, which they took into what would later become Washington, Allegheny, and Fayette and Greene counties. So the area north of Pittsburgh, between Pittsburgh and Meadville, Erie area, along the what is now Route 79 corridor, was largely uninhabited except for small pockets of American Indians who hadn't yet moved west. So an interesting family, an interesting story, and honestly, despite not believing in ghosts, I have absolutely no desire to go and visit the cemetery either at dusk or at night. And so there you go. That is one real spooky story in which I was involved, and which I will not soon forget.